the current phase of the war in the Middle East. Yesterday, we learned from a new article in Washington Post. They're talking about the United States is sending more weapons to the region. At least we've learned F-16s coming from Germany and F-35 from the United Kingdom. They're going to the region, and Iranian capabilities is getting somehow to Jordan, because all these weapons were somehow removed from the Persian Gulf Arab states to Jordan, and Iran is just hitting the targets in Jordan. That is one of the difficulties that of these fighter jets and missiles, or maybe American troops in Jordan. And the other point is, just 1 hour ago, Yemenis have announced a blockade on Saudi Arabia, which is something new because of the siege that they had on Yemen for many years. So coming back to the position of Donald Trump and his administration, which is basically right now, the main objective is to open up the Strait of Hormuz. And the continuation of the war, it seems that one of the main, tools in their hand or in their mind. Well, how do you see the current phase of the conflict between Iran and the United States?
Well, I've always believed that Iran has won this war, and that the United States has no strategy that it can employ to reverse that basic fact of life. I think that the memorandum of understanding that was signed on 17 June was basically a surrender document. The United States recognized that Iran had the upper hand. And if you look at the memorandum of understanding carefully, it's clear that the Iranians won on virtually every count. But then for some reason, President Trump decided that he was going to violate that memorandum. And he was going to try and create a channel through the Strait of Hormuz that was American dominated. And the Iranians, of course, said this was unacceptable. And they attacked some ships that tried to come through that American-dominated channel. The United States responded by attacking Iran. And you now have this tit-for-tat campaign that's taking place between the two sides. I think it started on July 8th, and with 1 or 2 days off, it's gone on constantly since then. And the question I think that you have to ask yourself is, what's the end result of this tit-for-tat strategy? Does the United States win? Does it get Iran to concede that it doesn't fully control the Strait of Hormuz? Or does the United States lose because the Iranians simply won't quit? And moreover, the Iranians have escalation dominance. Which one of those stories do you believe? And I personally think the evidence is manifestly clear that we meaning the Americans, cannot win the tit-for-tat strategy. And the Iranians can, and the Iranians are winning. If you look at what's happening, it used to be the case that nobody talked about bombing Jordan because all the American military assets that mattered to the Iranians were in places like Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, and so forth and so on. What's happened is that American bases in those Gulf states have been so thoroughly wrecked or destroyed or damaged that Jordan has become the place where we locate most of our key military assets to use against Iran. So what has now happened in recent times is that the Iranians are going after American forces inside of Jordan. And I think it's fair to say they are doing an excellent job from Iran's point of view in tearing apart those American installations inside of Jordan. And you get the sense watching this unfold that what's going to happen is that the United States is going to have to move all its military forces back to Israel. And by the way, Israel is not terribly enthusiastic about having those American military forces on its bases, because the Israelis understand, just like the Gulf states understand, and just like Jordan understands, that you become a giant magnet that attracts Iranian missiles and Iranian drones. And the Israelis don't want that any more than the Jordanians do, any more than the Gulf states do. So the United States is actually slowly but steadily losing its power projection capability in the Gulf. This all tells you that Iran has the upper hand. Now, what Trump has threatened to do, given this situation, is go after power stations and bridges and maybe oil facilities, what we sometimes call civilian infrastructure inside of Iran. This is how he's going to escalate in this tit-for-tat campaign and get the Iranians to finally throw up their hands. But this is not going to work because the Iranians will retaliate in kind, as they have demonstrated time after time. And the Iranians can effectively wreck countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait by going after their oil and gas facilities, going after their desalination plants. The Iranians have the upper hand as you go up the escalation ladder. So Trump's threat to go after civilian infrastructure inside of Iran is not going to produce victory for the United States. In fact, it's just going to make a bad situation worse. Now, my final point, and I don't want to go on too long here, but it is of enormous importance, is that the Houthis have announced that they're shutting down the Red Sea to Saudi traffic. As we all know, the Saudis have actually been shipping a lot of their oil out through the Red Sea. And they're not in a position to send stuff out through the Strait of Hormuz for all the obvious reasons. The Iranians control the Strait of Hormuz, but they have been able to send it out via a pipeline that goes across Saudi Arabia to the port of Yanbu, and then the oil's unloaded at Yanbu and shipped out through the Red Sea. Well, the Houthis have said they're shutting down Bab el-Mandab. That's the strait that is at the bottom of the Red Sea. The Houthis are going to shut it down to Saudi oil. This will have a huge consequence on the flow of oil out of the Gulf and the price of oil around the world. So this is really bad news for the United States. And it just shows you the extent to which the Iranians have lots of cards to play, and the Americans have no way of escalating and winning this tit-for-tat campaign that they started by violating the June 17 Memorandum of Understanding.
When it comes to the continuation of the war, many people would ask, cui bono? Who's going to benefit from that? And why is that so difficult for the United States to just withdraw from the Middle East? They're not going to lose anything other than their dominance in the Persian Gulf, which is so important, by the way, because before this war started, it was all free, nothing happening there. And right now, the main objective, as I've mentioned in my first question, is the opening up the Strait of Hormuz. But the continuation of the war, if you look at the situation as it was during the war in Ukraine, when you harm your allies, you're not going to get stronger. That's the logic. That's the way I understand it. And the allies of the United States in the West Asia are these GCC countries, Arab states. If you let them to go down the hole of this endless war, their economy going to be damaged, and they're not going to be in a good shape to help you. What is your understanding of that?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think if you go back to February 27th, it looked like to almost everybody, me included, that the United States had this formidable basing structure in the Gulf, and we had created a formidable alliance with the Gulf states. And it looked like we had the upper hand vis-a-vis the Iranians. I think everybody understood, or almost everybody understood, that Iran might shut down the Strait of Hormuz, but not many people, I think, and again, this would include me, understood the extent to which Iran could use its missiles and drones to wreck the American basing structure and ultimately undermine its alliance structure in the Gulf. And this, of course, is exactly what's happened. It's hard for me to imagine that the United States is going to rebuild those bases in the Gulf not only because the Americans are not going to want to build bases that are vulnerable to Iranian missiles, but also because the Gulf states are not going to want those bases there. Not as long as the United States has hostile relations with Iran. So it's hard to see how this basing structure and this alliance structure survives what's happened in this war that's taken place since February 28th. So I think the international politics of the Gulf are likely to be very different moving forward. And my sense is, and it's early in the game, so you cannot be too sure how this is going to play out, but my sense is, Nima, that what's going to happen is that the Gulf states will go to considerable lengths to work out a modus vivendi with the Iranians. It would seem to me that's the smart thing for them to do. And by the way, I think it's the smart thing for the Iranians to do. The Iranians' economy, or the Iranian economy, has clearly been wrecked, not only as a result of this war, but as a result of the economic sanctions that the United States and its friends have put on Iran for many years now. And also the 12-day war that took place last year. This is in 2025, where Israel and the United States attacked Iran. So enormous damage has been done to Iran's economy, and it clearly wants to recover. And if it wants to recover, that means having good relations with the other Gulf states, certainly not continuing this hostile relationship with those Gulf states that it now has. So I would think the Iranians have every incentive to work out a modus vivendi. And of course, as I'm saying, I think the Gulf states do as well. And I think if they can get the Americans out of there, that would be all for the good. The problem with the Americans, and it's very important to understand this, is that Israel wants to basically wreck Ukraine. Israel has a number of...
You mean Iran, Professor Mearsheimer?
Oh, yes. Sorry, Iran. Yeah, I didn't mean Ukraine. Yes, the Israelis want to wreck Iran. And they therefore are putting great pressure on the United States to stay in the fight. The Israelis don't want us to go back to another memorandum of understanding that looks anything like the one that was signed on 17 June. They were greatly dissatisfied with that memorandum of understanding. So there's a lot of pressure from the Israelis, and that means there's a lot of pressure from the Israel lobby inside the United States, and more generally from the hawks in the United States to stay in the fight. And they're constantly pushing President Trump not to go back to the memorandum of understanding. In fact, they pushed President Trump to move away from the memorandum of understanding. But the problem is that the hawks, and this is true of the Israelis as well, they have no war-winning strategy. We've lost. They refuse to accept that. Fine, you refuse to accept it, but you have to tell us what your clever strategy is that's going to allow us to win the war. And they have no clever strategy. Trump has tried every trick in the book. If there was a clever strategy there that we could use, we would have employed it long ago. It's not there. So we're basically doomed in the Gulf. And it's just a matter of time before Trump again comes around to recognizing that. Very important to understand, Nima. He recognized that on June 17th when he signed the memorandum of understanding. But then for some reason, he abandoned it. And he's going to be forced at some point to once again recognize that we have to cut a deal, that this war can't go on forever. It's not in America's national interest.
Yeah. How do you see the leverage, if there is some, of GCC countries on the foreign policy of the United States? Because I would ask, I want to know about the learning curve on their part. Yesterday, there was an interview of Iranian foreign minister on the Persian media. I watched it to see what is the Iranian position and what was their understanding before this war started. He said that he was communicating with his foreign ministers of GCC countries before the war started. They said their main message to Iranian was, the United States going to come in and together with Israel, they're going to destroy everything. Your oil facilities, your economy going to be destroyed, and you're going to be militarily defeated, and you're going to need us the day after. So you have to behave yourself. That was the tone before the war started. Then during the war, they somehow communicated with Iranians, and if you attack us, we're going to respond, but just keep it quiet. We're going to respond. You're not going to, retaliate. That was the sentiment before and during the war. And right now, everything is somehow changing and changing drastically. Is there any learning curve, in your opinion, for the region, all these countries in the region, to understand the reality of the Strait of Hormuz and the consequences of the war so far?
I think there's no question that most of the states have learned that being closely allied with the United States and that supporting this war in any way was a major mistake. I think you're correct that before the war started, they did not foresee what was going to happen. I think very few people foresaw what was going to happen. I'd be willing to bet a big chunk of money that most Iranians did not think that things would work out as well for Iran as they have. I think I would bet that, again, most Iranians are surprised by how successful they have been. I think they were confident they could withstand an American-Israeli onslaught. But I don't think that most Iranians understood just how successful they would be. And they have been, as you know, remarkably successful. This is not to say that the Iranians haven't suffered by any means, but nevertheless, they've prevailed in this war, in my opinion. Now, how this all plays out moving forward, I think, is dependent on which of the Gulf states you're talking about. If you look at the Saudis, I think the Saudis fully understand what has happened here. And I would imagine the Kuwaitis and the Bahrainians at this point in time understand full well what's exactly happening here. The UAE is a different story. The UAE looks like it's willing to throw its lot in with Israel and the United States and maintain a adversarial relationship with Iran moving forward. But even there, you see signs that the UAE understands that this is not in its interest, that it should move to establish a modus vivendi with the Iranians. And I would guess, I mean, who can say for sure, but I would guess that over time, the UAE will come to some sort of accommodation with the Iranians. It's in their interest. Continued war is a disaster for the UAE. So I would imagine that there is a significant amount of learning taking place among the states in the GCC, probably in some more than others. But nevertheless, I would argue that it's hard to miss what's going on here. You'd have to be pretty obtuse not to understand that being closely allied with the United States and going to war with the United States against Iran is not in your interest as a state in the Persian Gulf.
Do you see the war expanding or getting back to Israel because of the difficulties that the United States has right now with the fighter jets, with the weapons, air defense systems? And that would be problematic for Israel because of the air defense systems and the difficulties with interceptors. So how do you see the escalations as time goes by? We know that they have attacked a nuclear power plant yesterday in Iran, which is under construction. And the attacks on power grids, somehow desalinations are happening as we talk. In Kuwait, 2 of them were hit and 1 power plant was hit. And these things are getting worse, and going after infrastructure is hugely dangerous. And how is that going to play out for the case of Israel if the war continues?
Well, let me talk about the Israeli case in a second, because that's a great question. But just on infrastructure, there's no question that starting at the end of last week, the Americans began in a small way to go after civilian infrastructure, bridge and bridges and power stations inside of Iran. And the Iranians retaliated against desalination plants and power stations in places like Kuwait and Bahrain. But the attacks and counterattacks were limited. And it does not look like significant escalation involving civilian infrastructure has taken place yet. And if anything, it appears, and I want to underline the word appears, like the Americans are beginning to back off, that they understand that ramping up the attacks on civilian infrastructure in these tit-for-tat attacks is not in the US's interest. So we still have a long way to go, thankfully, before the tit-for-tat strategy truly escalates and reaches a dangerous level. So that's point number one. We have to keep our eye open, in other words, keep our eyes open, see what happens moving forward over this week. With regard to Israel, very interesting question you ask. First of all, I think the Iranians don't want to bring the Israelis into the fight. I think the Iranians understand that they have their hands full with the Americans, and if the Israelis get involved, it may be a major air offensive that looks a lot like the 40-day war that took place from February 28th to April 8th. And the Iranians don't want to go there. So I think the Iranians have little interest in attacking Israel. And I think it's quite clear that the Israelis have little interest in getting into the fight. The Israelis are wisely letting the Americans do the fighting while they remain on the sideline. This is a classic case of buck passing. And some of this has to do with the fact, as you were alluding to, that the Israelis don't have defensive missiles that they can use to protect themselves against the incoming Iranian ballistic and cruise missiles and the incoming Iranian drones. So the Israelis do not want to become a target. They don't want to look like Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. They want to stay on the sidelines. Now, the wild card here is the United States, because if the United States escalates, and this gets back to the first point, its attacks on civilian infrastructure, it will rely heavily on aircraft and especially tankers to refuel those aircraft that are based in Israel. And if that happens, I think the incentives for the Israelis to attack, for the Iranians to attack Israeli targets goes up significantly. So I think whether Israel gets into the fight depends in large part not on the Iranians or the Israelis themselves, but what the Americans do and whether or not the Americans really ramp up the attacks on civilian infrastructure. And again, if that happens, I think Israel will come in.